Good morning, everybody. I think that's really loud, so let me turn the gain down just a touch on this. Give me just a second. Let's try that, just a little bit. There we go. I wasn't here last week. Our family was out of town for the start of spring break. Was anybody here last week for the dessert practice? I saw one person post on Facebook that they thought it was a typo, and then they showed up and we made dessert cups, like, you know, the little pudding, Oreo, whipped cream, crumble toffee or whatever it is to make it look like a dessert. My brother, it's safe to talk about him. He would never watch anything that I did, my younger brother. Anyway, he would tell you that one of my favorite things to say is that you know that stressed spelled backwards is desserts, right? You know this to be true. I only said that once, but he was about 9 when I said it, and he's determined that that's my favorite thing to say. But I hope you enjoyed a little relief last week, and I'm glad to be with you again this week. We're going to look at Palladius the Historian, which actually is fair. We're going to read stories about other people. Palladius is the one that put them together. And reading about Palladius not only tells us about their lives and their witness, but also tells us a little bit about him and what he cared about and how he shaped really all of our reception of these desert mothers and fathers. So we're going to look at Palladius today. Let's start with a prayer. I hope you have a handout. If you didn't get a handout, there are some by the coffee pot. Let's read that prayer at the top of your handout. Let's read that prayer together. Almighty God, you have surrounded us with a great cloud of witnesses. Grant that we, encouraged by the good example of your servant Palladius, may persevere in running the race that is set before us, until at last we may, with him, attain to your eternal joy. Through Jesus Christ, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith, who lives and reigns with you and the Holy Spirit, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, let me remind you about the 2 weeks that I was here that we've spent in this series. It's a 5-week series if you count that week in the middle last week. The first week we looked at Antony of Egypt, sometimes called Antony the Great. Antony is also known as the father of monasticism. And what Antony reminds us of is the monos of that practice, the singularity of that practice. Antony is the one who showed us and taught us the value of going apart and being alone and going to the desert. In the desert, Antony did a lot of battling with demons. But that's not really why he went to the desert, though it might seem like it sometimes. Antony went to the desert to remove all the distractions of the world, the food, the temptations, the wealth, so that he could be one with God. And he kind of got that ball rolling and did so well that people would come out to the desert to see this Antony, and he becomes a really important figure in the history of desert Christianity. Then the second week, we looked at a far less well-known person, someone whose work really wasn't discovered until the middle of the 20th century, so in the history of Christianity, not long ago at all. And his name was Evagrius, and we talked about him as Evagrius the ascetic. Evagrius was actually a fairly gentle teacher, but was perhaps best known for being that, a teacher. Evagrius wrote 3 major works and some other smaller works. The first was the Practicos, the second was the Gnostikos, and the third was the Kephalaia Gnostica. The one I really focused on was the Practicos, the practical, the practice. Evagrius said, if you want to know God, here's what you got to do. Move out to the desert, stop eating, stop sleeping, pray all the time, and do all these things to subdue your passions, your temptations, your disturbances, so that you can achieve that state of availability for God, and then move into the knowledge of God, the kind of knowledge that led to the Gnostikos, which means knowledge, and then eventually he wrote his Kephalaia Gnostica, this kind of cosmological anticipation of what the future of the world looked like. But what I want to hold on from Evagrius is he had a very clear and strict regimen to instill, and yet he was a gifted teacher, one who knew how to shepherd, especially younger ascetics, younger monks, into that practice. So that's what we looked at. The thesis of our class, if you will, if you'll allow me that, is that being in the desert, being apart from the city, being apart from the institutional church and the clergy that looked like me, changed the way that these individuals said their prayers, changed the way they encountered God, changed the way they practiced their faith so substantially that a lot of how we think about God has been borrowed from that, and yet might seem strange unless we were to do something so strange as to renounce the world and move out to the desert. So this week and next week, we're going to do 2 more sessions of desert Christianity and look at those strange practices, but not just the practices. We're looking in particular at what they invite us into, and hopefully you're getting a sense of that. Let me pause and ask for questions. I need to get the microphone. Hold on a second. Let me get the microphone. Thank you, Kathy. I see you moving as well. And let me make sure I get one that doesn't interfere with my microphone. Thank you. Does anybody have a question or comment about where we've been on this journey, this desert Christianity journey? Yeah, Jeannie, right in the middle. Thank you.
I was taking notes as you were talking, and I anticipated what you were going to say, but you didn't say it. So I'm
say it. Yeah,
no,
thank you.
I'm probably wrong. So
thank you. No,
say
it.
I thought that the desert fathers and mothers influenced Christianity. It wasn't just that they did start this practice all by themselves out in the desert, but that it had this impact more than simply inviting us to think about how to pray.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right?
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
absolutely.
That's what you'd say.
Yep, absolutely. That's right. Yes. I would say if we wanted to sort of dissect that influence, I think part of it we would say is direct. People learned from Antony, people learned from Evagrius, people learned from Syncletica, people learned from Palladius. These texts, their sayings, were collected and distributed widely. We'll see that especially today. So some of that was direct influence. A lot of the direct influence, however, was mitigated or undermined by the institutional church that didn't always like what they had to say because they talked about God in radical ways. For example, Origen, in whose pedigree almost all of the desert Christians belong. Origen taught that all things and all people will be redeemed, even the devil himself. And it was just too much for the institutional church, who really liked being able to sort of have black and white evil, just to think about that. And so it was radical claims like that that got many of the desert Christians censored or their works sort of robbed of their power. And actually, it's only with the discovery of particularly the Coptic manuscripts, Coptic, think the Egyptian language written in Greek texts. It's the Coptic manuscripts that weren't widely understood that were able to persist. The ones that got translated into Latin, Greek, Arabic, Ethiopian, and the like, they were adulterated. So some of that influence is direct. But in addition to the direct influence, a lot of it is indirect, because before this, there was no monastic life. And think about through the Middle Ages, the medieval Europe, think about the importance of monastic, Cenobitic life in particular, those monastic communities. Think about Benedict, right? Benedict, there was no Benedict before there was an Antony, right? And think about all the ways that our faith and our practice is shaped by the monastic community, the relationship between monastic community and institutional religion. So also in those indirect ways as well, that kind of heritage. Yeah, absolutely. Lots of influence. Great. Anything else? Any other questions or comments about this desert Christian class? What else? Well, thank you. Let's look at Palladius. And I've got one image to share with you today. Palladius is better known than Evagrius, but there aren't any real pictures of Palladius out there. No art. Nobody bothered to draw Palladius. If you're a historian, you might know that your subjects get a lot of attention, but you often don't get a lot of attention except among your peers. Palladius, no exception. This is a chronology of the history writers, not just Palladius, but you'll see Rufinus and Palladius, principally those two. So these were theologians, historians, authors who were familiar with, and in the case of Palladius, lived the desert monastic life. Notice about when we're talking about. We're talking about in the middle of the 4th century, the 340s, right? We've got the 340s. About 363, Palladius was born. We're going to focus on Palladius and not really Rufinus. Palladius was born in Galatia. You might remember the letter to the Galatians, right? He was born in Galatia, but he moved to Palestine and enrolled in the monastery on the Mount of Olives. You might have remembered we talked a little bit about the religious community on the Mount of Olives, because that's where Antony started, and maybe Evagrius started before he moved out into the Egyptian desert. So Mount of Olives, I think Melania the Elder is kind of she was the central figure in the monastic community that's centered on the Mount of Olives. So he was there, and he was a part of that monastic community for a while, but apparently it wasn't quite rigorous enough for him, although distinct and ascetic, not truly separate. So like all of the desert Christians, decided that he needed to go further into the wilderness, and so Palladius moved first to Alexandria, the great center of study. He studied with Didymus the Blind. He also studied there, got to know that community. Origen, remember, was the second leader of this catechetical school in Alexandria. Alexandria's center of wisdom in the world, the Mediterranean world. Origen, that person that got into some trouble later on, had shaped that school. So Palladius spent years studying and learning theology in a very rigorous sense, but eventually moved out into the desert. There were two major desert communities, actually three, but the two that involve Palladius' life are Nitria and Kelia, and we've talked about them in some other examples. What makes Palladius so important to us is that he lived in those communities and he could speak of them not only as a visitor, but as someone who was a part of the community. And as you well know, history from outsiders is very different from history of those who lived in the community. So he lived in Nitria for a year and then moved to Kelia for about 9 years. We are told, ostensibly, that Palladius left the desert for health reasons. It's not an easy life, and it wasn't easy for him. It might be that he left for other reasons. We're not really sure. But about the time he left, around 400, is also the time when the Origenist controversy begins in Egypt. One new emperor takes the empire and is influenced by those who didn't like Origen in that tradition. And so when emperors are also in charge of picking bishops, and bishops are in power of sort of excommunicating or getting rid of those who follow a different opinion of theirs, such happens, and Origen becomes a persona non grata, and as a result, Palladius leaves Egypt about that time, and he moves to Constantinople, another center of learning and culture. But while he's in Constantinople, this layperson, Palladius, gets to know another name that I bet you remember, John Chrysostom, John the Golden Tongue, John, bishop known for his sermons. We sometimes hear his Easter sermon at the Easter Vigil. We still read his sermons. That's how beautiful his sermons were, and usually pretty short, which is unusual for an ancient preacher. But he studied with and was a supporter of John Chrysostom for a number of years until John Chrysostom said, look, I need to make you a priest and a bishop. So Palladius was ordained a bishop, and he served as the bishop of Aspuna, wherever that is. But about that time, not long after, Chrysostom, who had his own Origenist tendencies, was denounced at the Synod of the Oak, and was run out of his see. And as a result, those who were identified with John Chrysostom were also run out as well. Palladius did go to Rome to plead Chrysostom's case in about 404, but was unsuccessful. Pope Innocent I had no interest in that. And as a result, when Palladius came back to Constantinople, he too was exiled and had to live in exile for a while. He returned to Galatia, returned home after Theophilus, the emperor, died in 412. And it was while he was back home near the end of his life that he wrote his best-known work, the Lausiac History, which we're going to talk about mostly today. Of this text, only about this much of it is actually what he wrote. This is all introductory comments, so it's really a fairly short text. That doesn't make it particularly easy to read, but it is very concise, and you can find several translations of this. Be careful what translations you find. You want to find one based on the Coptic text rather than the Latin text or the Arabic text, because the Coptic text will give you some of those little pieces that got censored and removed. Palladius eventually died around 431. So that's the life of Palladius. I Observations, questions, comments. What do you notice about his life? What grabs your attention about that? And then we're going to talk about what he wrote in more detail. Anything about his life that interests you? He was a learned fellow. Remember, most of the monks in the desert were illiterate, but he had studied at the catechetical school. Someone of some means. People didn't get to travel. You didn't get elected bishop if you didn't come from some kind of resources. So a fairly well-educated and fairly well-to-do person, at least access to society, if you will. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, it sounds like I guess we don't know, but it sounds like he got caught up in controversies that were not of his own making by his aligning with John, and but we don't really know for sure, right? Is that?
That is fair. He got caught up in his controversies, but denominations face this kind of all the time, right? And particularly leaders in denominations are forced to make choices like, are you going to go with the breakaway group or are you going to stay with the ones that remain? When Origen and those who subscribed to Origen were denounced, those who stood on that side of the argument were kind of denounced with them. So I think it was fair because he would have said, yeah, I side on this, I'm on this side of the debate. Like, this is how I talk about God. This is how I understand. John Chrysostom, I think of him. John was never sort of fully denounced in that way. There was a kind of a slick talker at the Synod of the Oak that managed to denounce and get John Chrysostom exiled. Often, people in power use that power to meet their own ends. And there's always money involved somewhere along the way. So I certainly think it's fair in the sense that it wasn't just name recognition that got him thrown out. I think we will see in his text that he has an Origenist, meaning Origen, he has an Origenist theology that didn't sit well with the mainstream at that point. So, yeah. Yeah.
So what was his most famous work? You were just
the Lausiac History.
Oh, the Lausiac. Okay.
Yep. It named for Lausus, the chamberlain to the emperor who commissioned the work. Yep. Yeah. Questions, comments? Yeah.
Yes. How much do you know about the controversial parts of what John Chrysostom was teaching?
Yeah, not a lot. Not a lot. I think in the case of John Chrysostom, so Origen in the Eastern Church is revered as a doctor, teacher, a holy person. In the Western Church, denounced as a heretic and never kind of redeemed in that way. But he's not one of those heretics that's the really bad heretics, like the arch heretics, just someone whose teaching was outside the bounds of official church doctrine. John Chrysostom was never, ultimately John Chrysostom was not denounced like Origen was denounced. There was a political scam to get him thrown out. But I'm trying to think of a good analogy for how to put that. This is one. What was his name? Hold on. A great translator who went to Africa and translated, just a gifted translator. Oh, Colenso, Bishop Colenso. Do y'all know the story of Bishop Colenso, the Anglican bishop who went to Africa? Great, beautiful, wonderful translator. Translated the gospel into lots of different indigenous texts so that individuals could hear. Well, Colenso believed in universal salvation. Everybody goes to heaven. Couldn't believe that. Denounced as a heretic, but not the kind of heretic that, he ran afoul of who was in charge those days. And so some people still don't like Colenso, but for the most part, Colenso's pretty well accepted these days. Chrysostom happened to run afoul of some people in that moment, but ultimately, because he said some things that were on the edge of that, enough to get him denounced, but not thoroughly enough to sort of repudiate or excoriate all of his teaching. Yeah. All right, let's dig into the Lausiac history. Which sounds really boring, but I don't want you to think about it in at least not in that boring way. It's vivid and exciting and scary and kind of ridiculous at times. A 20th century historian and theologian made his name by saying, "None of this is true. It was all made up." And, it's actually easy in the 20th century to say, yeah, it's all too ridiculous, it's too fantastic. But actually, remarkably enough, manuscript research And sort of scholastic analysis lets us know that he wasn't making this up. There are secondary sources that verify these stories. How they happen and how they're told always remains to be questioned. But remarkable. Whoops, that's not helpful. Remarkable consistency in the text and across the manuscripts. And if there's anything to be critical of with him, it actually probably belongs not to Palladius, but to those who wrote and revised and edited his work on his behalf, usually without asking. What also makes this history peculiar, as I said earlier, is that it's a memoir as much as anything. And Palladius is pretty good about saying, and we'll see one example of this, he's pretty good about saying, I saw this with my own eyes, or this person told me this happened, or this person told me that this person said it had happened. So he's kind of willing to share with you the legitimacy or the layers of his sources when it's a secondary account and when it's a firsthand account, which is helpful when historians will do that for us. This text becomes very famous. It's translated very quickly into Latin, Syriac, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, and Arabic. But the problem with any translation is that things are changed, sometimes intentionally and sometimes unintentionally. The example I always use is the word in Greek for sarx from which we get sarcoma. It means flesh, body. When you translate that into some languages, it turns out to be something more like beef steak. And so in some translations of the Bible, in some languages, when Jesus says, my flesh is food indeed, what you hear is, my steak is food indeed. And it just sort of loses that integrity, but there's no other way to do it. We talked about that last time when we looked at the concept of apatheia, that apathy, but it's not apathy, it's kind of immune to the passions of the world, a state of being. So whenever those translations happen, sometimes some things just get a little messed up, but often they get messed up on purpose as things harmless. A scholar of this era writes, they get rewritten, rearranged, enlarged, shortened, paraphrased, and combined with kindred works. It's nice to be famous, and it's nice to be liked, but if you get liked that much, people don't have a tendency to respect what you wrote, and they kind of make it their own. But the reasons that this text is so important to us is not only does it tell us what monastic life was like in those two great centers, an eyewitness account of what was happening in Nitria and Kelia, but it also shows us more vividly the connection between this strange monastic life and what we would call the miraculous, the supernatural. Lots of accounts of really bizarre things happening and how the monastics just seem to find them over and over again. And the other way that it's really important, and this is certainly beyond my scholarship, is that this particular text becomes a pattern for how monastic life is written about for centuries. So when we read about what later, even medieval monastic communities are like, the thing that most greatly influenced how those texts were assimilated and propagated was actually this bit that was written way back in the early 5th century. So great influence, both direct and also indirect. Let's read a couple of examples, and you'll notice the handout has a staple, which means I got more for us to read than usual, so I'll talk a little less and let us hear a little bit more. Let's start with that first passage, which is about Ammonios, and I've titled it Vivid Examples. Kathy, would you take the microphone to someone who is willing to read for us, please, those first two paragraphs, that part called Vivid Examples? Thank you. Aaron?
This Ammonius, Pambo's disciple, together with 3 other brothers and his 2 sisters, excelling in love for God, went to live in the desert, the women making themselves a dwelling and he one for himself, a sufficient distance apart from each other. As the man was an outstanding scholar, a certain city desired him to be bishop. They went to the blessed Timothy, beseeching him to ordain him to be their bishop. Bring him to me, he said, and I will ordain him. When they came to Ammonius, and with a retinue, and he saw that he was caught, he besought them, swearing that he would not accept ordination, and neither would he come out of the desert, but they would have none of it. With them looking on, he took a pair of scissors and sheared off his left ear at the base, and said to them, From now on, be assured that it is impossible for me to become a bishop, since the law forbids a person with an ear cut off to be brought into the priesthood." With that, they left and went away. They came and told the bishop, and he said to them, "Let that law be observed by the Jews. Even if you brought me somebody with his nose cut off, I would ordain him if he had a worthy character." Off they went again and besought him, but he swore to them, "I will cut out my tongue if you coerce me." So they left him and went away. This amazing thing is told of Ammonius. He never spared himself when delight in his flesh rose up to attack him. He would apply a red-hot iron to his members, with the result that he was always scarred. From when he was a young man until death, his fare at table was raw, for he never ate anything that had been cooked except bread. He had memorized the Old and New Testaments, and among the writings of learned men, Origen, Didymus, Pyrrhus, and Stephen, he had read 6 million lines, as the fathers of the desert bear him witness. He was a consolation like none other to the brothers in the desert. The blessed Evagrius used to give this judgment on him, saying, "I never saw a person more advanced in apatheia than he was."
Thank you. What do you notice? Where's your attention fall? Isn't it the ear? Isn't it great? Don't you love it? Yeah, the ear. Yeah. Why do you think Palladius told that story? Like, what is it? Why does this historian, surely there were other stories about Ammonius, but why the story about his left ear? Why would he cut off his left ear? So one question is, why would Ammonius bother to cut off his left ear? Why did he really not want to be ordained like that? Another question is, why did they want Ammonius of all people? But a third question is, so why would Palladius write this? What's his teaching? It's not just there was a guy named Ammonius and he was a strange fellow, but what do you hold on to? What do you hear in this? Yeah. Don't be ordained, right? No, I'm just kidding. Yeah, the spiritual or the physical. Yeah, and ordination meant something like that, right? Notice the language that Palladius uses as in the fifth line down. As the man was an outstanding scholar, a certain city desired him to be a bishop. City and desert were at odds with each other, right? Are you going to live the city life or the country life? But by country life, we don't mean what we think of as country life. We mean like out in the desert where you don't see anybody, where you don't eat anything. You can't live like that in the city. You can't be a bishop and live like that because you have to go to people's houses and eat at their dinner parties and show up at church, and you have to be around other people. Like, you can't get away with being a bishop and live in a cave in the middle of nowhere. And so Ammonius and Palladius understands that there's something pure and powerful about this desert Christian life that those in the city don't understand. And so he's not just rejecting ordination and all that comes with it, but he's also rejecting city life. And I think Palladius describes that. He identifies those who sought him as being of the city, and then later on he said he would not come out of the desert, right? So clear distinction there. What else do you notice in this strange encounter about Ammonius? What else? I think we get a little bit in. Sometimes I think the language betrays us. Whenever delight in his flesh rose up to attack him, meaning whenever he was tempted by the comforts of the world, right? A hungry stomach, the desire to sleep on a comfy bed. Maybe it was sexual lust, but whenever these desires rose up in him, he refused to give in to them. And what was his practice? To take a red-hot iron poker and to burn himself with it. And he did it so often that he always had scars. He always had wealth. Imagine seeing someone who every time he showed up, he was covered with sort of sores because of his ascetic practice, because he insisted on subjecting himself to this bizarre torture. Why would anybody do that? If you gave Palladius and Ammonius the best benefit of the doubt, what's the best possible way that they would describe the benefit of such a radical behavior, right? Yeah, just think about that. Think about what it means for someone to not understand self-mutilation like that to be sinful or dangerous or harmful, but actually helpful. Like, what does that tell us about the nature of their practice? And Palladius has an eye for the, for the extreme in those ways. Lots of examples like that. I think, though, that what Palladius wants us to hold on to is not that we should likewise subject ourselves to that burning, but instead that our focus should be on the goals. And there are two judgments that he offers right at the end of the passage that I've given you. First, his own editorial interpretation, and then he quotes Evagrius as well. Ammonius was a consolation like none others to the brothers in the desert. There's nobody else who is able to give comfort and consolation to the other monks like Ammonius. His gift to the community was a reality, a realness to that. And he was able to guide them as nobody else could. Evagrius, that great ascetic who had taught the practice. Remember the last time I was here, we talked about how that practice leads to that state of passionlessness, immutability to the distractions of the world. And even Evagrius, the expert on passionlessness, said that there was nobody more devout in that way than Ammonius. And so it feels to me like Palladius knows how to tell a story, right? Palladius knows how to hook you with the dramatic, the cut off ear and the burning of the skin. But what he's really pushing us to is imagine what it means to be so devoted that you could help others find God like this. Imagine what it means to achieve that. Kind of a hopeful, encouraging text, if you will, that there's an end to this, there's a goal to this. Yeah. Thoughts about that, reflections about that. Jeannie?
He was subjugating his ego.
Sure.
Yeah, it's going for the spiritual, but it's also subjugating his ego, which would make him more able to empathize with other monks and be a better teacher because he wouldn't be bothered by his own ego.
Sure. Yes. In a way that, when you're in the desert and you live by yourself, we're not going to read about it, but one of these individuals, when they pride themselves on, I lived in this community for 10 years and I never took a bath. Right? That's gross. But the reason they do that is for that self-mortification, a different understanding of kind of spiritual practice, the taming of the ego. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Anything else about Ammonius? Yeah. Yeah, Vince.
If he were really subjugating his ego, wouldn't he burn himself in places that would be covered by his clothing so that he wasn't, demonstrating it to other people?
Yeah.
And again,
presumably, I think part of his practice, I don't know what his daily routine was, but most of these monks lived all by themselves, right? And you come to the community in your loincloth because you didn't have any other clothes. You come every once in a while to sort of say your prayers and have Eucharist together, and then sort of go back. So I don't. At least he's presented to us as not trying to get credit for it. We're going to see an example of a guy named Valens, who we see kind of virtue gone awry. I'm going to hand you this. Welcome, glad you're here. So we're going to see what happens. It's not universal acclaim, right? He's going to let us know later on that if your heart's not in the right place, there's no practice that'll save you, which I think might help us get there a little bit. One of the things I want to note about this text before we read the next bit is that it's like this. It's narrative. It's all stories. It's not philosophizing. It's not theology in that systematic way. Never does Palladius say, all right, this section is going to be about prayer. This section is going to be about ascetic practice. This section is going to be about apatheia. This section is going to be about sacrament. It's just story after story, and when you read it, it's kind of scattered. They're not organized alphabetically. The Sayings of the Desert Fathers, another great, important text, is organized alphabetically. This isn't. It's almost random, if you will. But if you read it, you can start to see these kind of arcs, these themes that emerge, and we see that actually someone as skilled and knowledgeable as Palladius was able to weave this together to share a message, a theme, and to teach us something. He is a fan of these outlandish claims, really outlandish claims, but he tries, and I'm not sure he always succeeds, but he tries to use them to make a larger point, and not just to sort of hand to us, you should do that too, but instead to say to us, you should seek the same things that these radical monks were seeking. Let's listen to the second passage. Who would read for us, please, what I've titled Making a Point about Macarius the Alexandrian? Who would read about Macarius for us on to the next page as well? Somebody? Thank you, Jeannie. We can use you. Appreciate it.
When Macarius of Alexandria heard that the folk at Tibezia, is that right?
Sure.
Tibezia, had a great way of life, he disguised himself, taking on the appearance of a working-class secular person. He traveled the desert for 15 days and came to Thebad. When he got to the monastery of the folk of Tibezia, he sought out there a archimandrite, whose name is Pachymonius. Am I getting any of these words right?
You picked the right one.
A man of great experience who had the spiritual gift of prophecy. It was hidden from him who and what Macarius was. When he encountered him, Macarius said to him, I beg you to take me into your monastery so I may become a monk. Said Pachomius to him, anyway, you are advanced in age and cannot undertake spiritual discipline. The brothers practice it. You won't endure their toil. You'll be offended and go off speaking ill of them. And he did not take him in either the first or second day. This went on for 7 days, but Macarius persisted, fasting, and finally he said to Pachymonius, quote, take me in, Abba, and if I do not fast and work as they do, order me to be thrown out. Then Pachymonius persuaded the brothers to take him in among them. So he went in. A short time went by, and Lent was at hand. Macarius saw that each one practiced spiritual discipline by a different way of life. One ate in the morning, one ate second evening, one every fifth. Then again, one stood all night long and then sat during the day. So Macarius steeped a large quantity of palm fronds and stood in a corner. He touched neither bread nor water until the days of Lent had run their course and Easter had come and gone. He neither bent his knees nor reclined. He would take nothing but a few leaves of cabbage, and that on Sunday, to give the impression that he was eating. When all the monks had seen, they rose up against the higoman, saying, quote, from where did you bring us this fleshless man to condemn us? Either get rid of him, or be aware that we are all taking off. So when Pachymonius heard the details of Macarius' way of life, he prayed to God for it to be revealed to him who this was. It was revealed to him, and taking Macarius' hand, he led him into the house of prayer where the altar was, saying to him, come now, venerable one, you are Macarius, and you concealed it from me. I have longed to see you for many years. I am grateful to you for smiting my children, so they do not have a high opinion of their spiritual discipline. Do you now go on to your place, for you have sufficiently edified us, and pray for us. So Macarius went away as requested.
Thank you. So this strange old guy shows up, and he says, I want to be a monk too. And the guy says, you can't hack it. You can't hack it. You're too old to start. It's not worth it. And 7 days later, he finally convinces him, and he shows everybody up, right? The text wants us to see that if you're fasting on the second day, I'm going to fast on the second day. And if you're on the third day, I'm going to fast on the third day as well. I'm going to do I'm going to take all of your disciplines on, and I'm going to show you that I'm better at them than all of you. Because Macarius was this seasoned monk, and they didn't recognize him. And the people revolted. They were like, I love that phrase. Where did you find this fleshless fellow, right? This guy who doesn't suffer the way we suffer, who never gets hungry, who never gets tired, who never complains. Like, he's driving us crazy. Either you get rid of him or we're leaving. I love it. What a beautiful and dramatic story. And yet, right at the end, we get to hear, why does Palladius include this, right? Why does Palladius, I have longed to see you. I've heard of you. I'm so glad to meet you. Thank you for coming to humble us, so that we wouldn't be too haughty about our own spiritual disciplines. But would you please leave now and pray for us? Because we can't handle it anymore. Like I love that kind of, that just humor and humility and also the ability to see that. Let me read you another story about Macarius that I didn't include in this from earlier in this text. When Macarius was sitting in his cell one morning, a mosquito landed on his foot and stung him. This hurt him, so he squashed it with his hand, releasing a flow of blood. Recognizing that he had avenged himself, Macarius sentenced himself to remain naked for 6 months by the marsh of Skeet, which is in the great desert, where the mosquitoes pierce even the skins of wild boars, for they are like wasps. He was pierced all over, and this produced such swellings that some thought he had elephantitis. When he came back to his cell 6 months later, it was only by his voice that it was known that he was Macarius. So, for a purpose, right? It's not just to it's because in this ridiculous way that I don't really get or understand, Macarius knew that pride, sin, vengeance was dwelling in him, and he needed to teach himself in the extreme way what it means to let go of that, to be available for God. And Palladius records these beautiful, vivid stories to kind of convey to us. I bet you can begin to hear a little about like the Reformation Martyrs. Like if you've ever studied the sort of medieval Europe, the Reformation period, you'll hear these stories about how they, think of Joan of Arc, right? Any of these, not Reformation before that, but think about any of these great martyrs who died, whose stories are still told, how they with dignity bore the suffering. This is how we talk about saints. And the reason we talk about saints like this is because of Palladius and those who followed him. One of the other curious things about Palladius is that unlike almost all of the other accounts of the desert Christians, Palladius gives us a lot about women. Most of the other desert writers only write about the men, of course, only write about the monks. They also almost only write about Egyptians because those are the people who live there, with a few exceptions. We sometimes get a Palestinian or a Syrian, but not many. Palladius gives us a breadth of history, men and women, old and young, of lots of different ethnicities and nationalities, and he also gives us people from all walks of life. He gives us former slaves, he gives us working class, merchant class, and even some of the elites, and he gives us all of their stories as well. Let's read 2 bits. Who would read the bit about holy women for us? Who might read that? All the way up in the front. Thank you. And let's hear about, the first is kind of an introductory comment that Palladius gives at the beginning of one of his sections just about women, and then I'm going to jump back in his text to hear about a particular woman whose name I can't really pronounce, but I think it's Potamian or something like that, but I trust you to get it right. So, holy women, thank you.
In this book, I must also commemorate some courageous women whom God granted equality in prizes with men, so as not to allege that they are less vigorous in the quest for virtue. This blessed Isidore met Antony of sacred memory, and he told me something he heard from him that is worth putting down in writing. In the time of Maximian, the persecutor, there was a most beautiful maiden called Potamiani, somebody's handmaid. Although her master entreated her with many promises, he was not able to seduce her. In the end, he was so angry that he handed her over to the then governor of Alexandria, betraying her as a Christian who was criticizing the times and the emperors for the persecutions. Her master bribed the governor, saying, "If she agrees to my proposition, keep her unpunished." But her master besought him, if she persisted in her inflexibility, to torture her so she would not live to laugh his profligacy to scorn. When she was brought before the judgment seat, her resolution was assaulted with various instruments of torture, including a large cauldron that the judge ordered to be filled with pitch and heated. When the pitch was boiling and thoroughly seething, he proposed to her, "Either go and submit to the wises of your master, or be quite sure that I shall order you to be put into the vessel." In answer, she said to him, "May there never be such a judge as one who would order people to submit to profligacy." In a rage, he ordered her to be thrown naked into the vessel, but she spoke out, saying, "By the head of your emperor, whom you revere, if it is your decision to torture me like this, then order me to be let down into the vessel little by little, so you might know with what great fortitude the Christ whom you do not know furnishes me." For an hour, she was let down little by little, Then she expired when the pitch reached her neck.
Thank you. How about that? How about that? I like the fact that as a historian, he notes from the beginning, I heard this from someone who heard it. So he didn't see this, he didn't know this. But how interesting that Palladius chooses to write this down. He didn't have to write this down. Nobody else is writing the stories of women. And yet there's something about Palladius' experience of the desert, something about his experience of these communities that did include women, though separate, that he wanted to make sure to convey. And I love the way he describes it in that first little bit that I included for you, the language of equality, right? I must also commemorate some courageous women whom God granted equality in prizes with men, so as not to allege that they are less vigorous. He doesn't want anybody, because nobody's talking about the women, he doesn't want people to think that the women aren't working as hard, praying as hard, suffering as hard, experiencing the same holiness. Partly this might be because Palladius became a monk at the Mount of Olives, where Melania the Elder was the leader of that community. A woman was leading a diverse religious community. Elsewhere in his history, Palladius writes a lot about Melania. He's got several sections that he wants to write about Melania. But it's not just her, it's lots of women. There's something about that formation as a monk that gave him an insight to share these stories, vivid stories. This sounds a lot like a burning at the stake, right? This sounds a lot like a more recent martyr that we might remember. Anything that you hear in that description or notice about this story about a woman, a slave woman who was killed by the authorities? Anything that you would highlight for us? Anything that you would ask or wonder aloud? Well, in our closing, let me read The Virtue Gone Awry, because I'm a fast talker. And I want us to be able to hear this before we leave. And this is the individual who Palladius includes. And there are a couple of examples, maybe 3 or 4 in his history, of people whose sin got in the way. This is about Valens. There was a person called Valens, a Palestinian by race, but a Corinthian in character, for St. Paul attributed the disease of self-importance to the Corinthians. He reached the desert and lived with us for several years. He went so far in pride that he was beguiled by demons. By beguiling him a little at a time, they made him have big ideas, such as that angels were in contact with him. Then one day, as they recounted it, while he was working in the dark, he dropped a needle with which he was stitching a basket. As he could not find it, the devil made a lamp and found the needle. Thinking even more highly of himself at this, Valens had big ideas again. He became so self-important that he even spurned the mysteries of Holy Communion. Confident now that Valens was absolutely convinced by his deceit, off went the demon and disguised himself as the Savior. And he appeared by night in a vision of thousands of angels holding lamps and a wheel of fire, in which he appeared to represent the Savior. One preceded the others, saying, Christ was enamored of your way of life and your confident way of living it. He has come to see you. So come out of your cell and do nothing more than fall down and worship him when you see him from afar, then go into your cell. So out he went, and once seeing the formation of lamp holders and the Antichrist about a stayed away, he fell down and worshipped. Again the next day, he was so raving mad that he went into the church, and when the brotherhood was assembled, said, I do not need communion, for I have seen Christ today. Then the fathers bound him, and putting him in irons, treated him over the course of 1 year, and removed his self-conceit with prayers, indifferent food, and a less active life, as it is said, opposite cures for opposite. So he includes several examples of individuals whose practice was empty. And I love, and this becomes sacramental in nature, right? He's so deceived was Valens that he even thought himself that he didn't need Holy Communion anymore. He'd found Jesus. The community corrects him in that way, locks him in stocks, feeds him simple food, and makes him rest because a boring life will lead to more boring things. So what a vivid description of a practice that was misguided. That's the danger. And we don't see that very often. We see it a little bit in the Practicae and some of the other warnings, but we don't usually see it in a narrative account. We see it as a warning. For example, we read Antony, I think it was Antony, might have been Evagrius, but Antony said, it was Antony, the 8 deadly sins or the distractions, if you will, said, look, the middle of the day is the hardest, right? You stare out your window and 1 minute seems like hours and you're just waiting for the heat of the day to pass. That's dangerous. That's a dangerous time for a monk. But we don't often see stories of those who had fallen, stories of those who had made a mistake, and in this case, redeemed, if you will. I think this helps us hear Palladius' history, not only as let me tell you the highlights of the desert life, but for a purpose. What is that purpose? Why bother? Why are these monks in the desert? Why are these people doing these crazy things that city folk can't make sense of? And the answer is these kind of holy encounters, this kind of holy availability for what the Spirit is doing among them, for these holy encounters with God. The desert Christians moved out into the desert not only to get away from the city and the distractions, but because the desert is the place where the wilderness is, where God is sort of active and unbridled. It's the place where Satan shows up and tempts Jesus, but it's also the place where the angels minister to Jesus, right? It's that rugged, undomesticated place. Think about the significance of that word domesticated, right? It's that undomesticated place where dangerous and holy things happen. And this Palladius' history invites us not only to marvel at it, though there's certainly a lot of that, but also to think, there's a reason for this, and I wonder how I might take that on. I wonder how my Lenten practice might be a little different if I think of it with an end in mind, as not just an end in of itself, but as a means to a greater end. Let me pause for a moment. Reflections, comments, questions as we finish up today. These are great texts. Questions, thoughts, anything that you would ask or offer? We've got one more week, and we're going to look at Syncletica, the sufferer, Syncletica. We might add some other texts. I wanted to focus in particular on one of the desert mothers. So next week we're going to look at Syncletica, and we'll talk about her in particular, her suffering, and how her suffering is itself an act of faithfulness. I think the desert mothers and fathers help us see that suffering in and of itself, it might be a reminder of that which is bad, but it can be a means to a great good, something we don't hear about a lot. So I'm glad y'all are here, and I hope you'll be back next week. Thank you.